Okay, everybody, so this is chapter 1. It's an introduction to anatomy, and what you should do for all of these lectures is to have your outline notes with you and something to take notes with, because I do add some material to the outline when we talk about the PowerPoint images. So hopefully you have those, and let's get started. So what you're looking at here is just an anatomy class that took place in 1632. Back then, of course, human anatomy was something that you had to use actual human specimens for, so they would have to use bodies, and they learned about anatomy that way. Now we have all kinds of simulations and models, 3D imaging, that, you know, it's come a long way, but this is the very beginning of human anatomy. Here's another class I thought I'd tell you, or let you see. It's a little bit 100, 200 years later. This is a famous drawing. Maybe you've seen it, Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. This is his, he was basically a very famous he drew anatomical images. He drew people really well. And this is sort of his idea of what a ideal human proportions would be. So the head is this big, the torso then would be this long, legs would have to be, and arms would have to be the length that they are. Anyway, so he also did this drawing of a skull, which is very detailed. When we get to the skull, you'll be learning all the different kinds of holes. They all have names. The bumps have names. Areas have different names. So the skull is very, very complex. And we can see that he did a really good job of drawing out all these little features of the skull. This is just another image from the Renaissance period. This is something that we'll see later on in the semester. This is obviously a person holding their skin, and this was recreated by a company called Body Worlds that maybe you've also heard of. And Body Worlds comes around to Los Angeles. It's a traveling show, and so every once in a while the California Science Center will have Body World. So after this class, and after you get familiar with human anatomy, when we can go back into a crowded museum, I highly recommend you go see Body Worlds. All right, so we're going to get started with our first topic of anatomy, which is, if you look at the definitions, we have different definitions of what anatomy can be, or what anatomy can entail, and then all these categories people can go into each field. So the first one is called microscopic anatomy, and microscopic anatomy means basically what you can see with a microscope, right? So the word microscopic means that these items, these structures, are not going to be able to be seen with the naked eye, so you have to use a microscope. Cytology is the study of cells. So cyto is the prefix for cell. Ology is the study of, right? So this is the study of cells. And by looking at the shapes of cells, what they look like morphologically, how they appear to you under the microscope, this tells you a lot about cells. You can actually, in this field, for example, a pathologist is a medical doctor. I'll write the word pathologist here. Is a medical doctor who can take a look at tissues and determine if they're cancerous, or if there's some kind of disease process going on, or if they're normal. So you can actually see the differences in normal cells and tumor cells, for example. So that's what this example is looking at. So you have some tumor cells in picture A, and they use these terms to be very, very specific and detail-oriented, right? Pleomorphic round to ovoid cells. Pleomorphic, just a quick example. Pleomorphic means it has different shapes to it. You can see that these cells, they don't all have the same exact shape in box A. They're round to ovoid, right? So they're either round or ovalish. And then, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of different technical terms here to just describe precisely these cells. So you have to be very precise in anatomy, because you need to have the same language. Everybody needs to speak the same language in order to convey what is actually going on in the cells or in the body. Okay, so microscopic anatomy includes cytology, which is the cells, And I have little asterisks in your outline, which is the cells are the smallest unit of life. So remember from Bio 3, oops, sorry about that. The cells are the smallest unit of life. So the cells can do all of the characteristics of life. So remember from Bio 3, that was reproduce, it was evolve, it was to use energy, to have order, all those different things that you learn in Bio 3, that's what a cell can do. So a cell is by definition alive because it can do all those characteristics of life. Let's move on to the second picture here. So this is called histology. So histology is also a field using a microscope. It's looking at tissues. So now tissues are more than just a collection of cells. If we go back to this picture, we can see that we have a lot of cells. Each purple dot in these images is a nucleus. And so we can see that there's, a collection of cells here, but they are all pretty much the same. They look the same, right? So if you want to study a tumor, it's basically a mass of basically one kind of cell. Tumors can be different kinds of cells together, but you're just looking at the cells. In histology, this is the study of tissues, and tissues are different kinds of cells that come together to make a higher ordered structure. So for example, the tongue, right? You're going to have tissue that is going to be darker staining at the top. That's the top of your tongue. That's epithelial tissue if you are curious. Then you're going to have a lot of muscle, right? So all this light pink stuff with the letter M that I'm drawing is all muscle. So this is your muscle of the tongue. And then you have glands. You can see that this area here is different. So those are glands of the tongue. So the tongue itself, or the tissue of the tongue, is going to have different kinds of cells in it. And then you can see and compare how the tissue itself changes when it's diseased, right? So we have our cancerous boxes at the bottom, we have our normal boxes at the top. And so a person who studies cells will also study tissue. So a pathologist, that person we talked about, can also recognize abnormal tissues. So those two go together. In the outline, I also have the 4 basic tissue types are epithelial, nervous tissue, muscle tissue, and connective tissue. So don't worry about that for now in chapter 1. Chapter 3, chapter 3 basically goes over each one of those tissue types. So there's a section on epithelial tissue, a section of nervous tissue, muscle, and connective tissue. So that's all chapter 3. But in general, there's 4 tissue types in the human body. All right, so what about gross anatomy? Gross anatomy is macroscopic. So this now is something they do not need the microscope for. This is using just the naked eye. So when I say naked eye, I mean just your eyes without a magnifying glass, without anything to help your eyes. So gross anatomy here is a class that you may have heard that medical students need to go to, right? Because they go in, they dissect the human body, they learn about the position of organs and blood vessels and nerves and all that, but they don't need any special equipment. They just use their eyes. All right, so gross anatomy. When you look at the sub parts of gross anatomy, there's surface anatomy. So surface anatomy is something that's really, really good for people who are physical therapists or massage therapists, but even for physicians, it's really good to have a very good knowledge of your surface anatomy. So when you look at the surface of a body, you know exactly what feature is where, what muscles are where, and then sometimes you'll have areas. So for example, this muscle here is the sternocleidomastoid, then you have your clavicle, and then you have your trapezius. And then in this area, this is a little triangle where you know where other features are. So it's kind of a useful thing for locating blood vessels, locating nerves, and also for just physical therapy and different things like that. So surface anatomy is what you can see from the surface of the body. I jumped ahead a little bit. So in regional anatomy and systemic anatomy are just different approaches to learning anatomy. So regional anatomy is if you go on to higher levels, say you want to be a physical therapist, but you're going to be a head and neck physical therapist, then you're going to be really learning the head and neck region. So you learn the region together. You learn all the nerves, the muscles, the tissues that you find in the head and neck. Medical schools will sometimes approach anatomy in this way, where you learn a holistic approach to one part of the body. We are going to learn anatomy with systemic, in the systemic way. So you're going to learn each system separately. So systemic anatomy is that you consider each organ system separately, and that's how your book is organized. So your textbook is, chapter 3. Chapter 4 is the skin, which is the integumentary system, and then we move on to bones and we move on to muscles. So it's separated. And that's a very common way for introductory classes to present anatomy, is systemic. All right, let's move on to developmental anatomy. So developmental anatomy is the study of the development of humans from the conception, the time that sperm and egg meet, to physical maturity. So as you can guess, when you're very, very small, right, in these initial stages, you're going to need a microscope, even also to probably these stages. You need a microscope to see this, or some kind of tool to enlarge the embryo or the fetus. And then at other stages, you won't need it. So it encompasses both, cytology, microscopic anatomy, and surface anatomy. The word embryo, embryology, is the first 2 months of life. So what you can see here is basically embryology. Embryology, there's a lot of very basic, very important things going on in embryology. So if something goes wrong, you can have very huge repercussions in the human body, because everything is so small and everything's so, you have such few cells that if one cell has a problem with it, then it correlates to having a huge problem later on, because that one cell will divide and make problems later on. Okay, so embryology. So we call the embryo is what you call the first 2 months of development. So you have an embryo inside your body, and then after that you have a fetus. So the fetus is at month 3 and beyond. Let's look at another image here. This is comparative anatomy. So comparative anatomy is going to compare one organism with another or several organisms together. So you have here a basic vertebrate body plan. If you look at this picture here, it's this guy here. So we have this basic vertebrate body plan, and we all vertebrates, so all the organisms that have a backbone, which is what the word vertebrate means, will develop in this very similar fashion as an embryo. So we all look the same as an embryo, and then they start to change, right? So salmon will mature into a salmon, chicken will mature into a chicken, and humans will mature into the human form. But because we all have a very similar past, we're all related in the on the evolutionary time scale, then the fact that our embryos are all the same it supports the fact that we're all related, because we all started to develop in the same way, and then later on we diverged in the way that we developed. All right, so that is comparative anatomy, and we use comparative anatomy now to learn about different organisms as well as ourselves. So there's features that evolved into having new functions, but it's interesting to look at what they've done in the past for other organisms. Moving on to radiographic anatomy. This is basically what x-rays are used for, but not only x-rays, ultrasound and other things like CAT scans and MRIs can be used sort of as radiographic anatomy. So you get an image from using x-ray for looking at this, and people can get trained. Radiology techs, for example, you can get trained to take x-rays and to look at x-rays and to see if it was a good picture. This is a really cool x-ray of a skull. I like to show you this because you can kind of make out the skull features. So you can see that this is our eye socket, right? This is called an orbit, where our eyeball would sit, and our eyeball is packed in with a lot of fat. And then what's interesting here is, you know that above your eyes you have your forehead, but look at this space. So we know that in x-rays, bone shows up as white, right? So the very bright white areas, this is very heavy bone. This bone here is what is called your nasal septum. It divides your nose into the right and left halves. But if you look here, there is a gray area that's not white. So I'm going to outline for you this space, right, that we can see here. This is called the frontal sinus. So your frontal bone is, so here's the word frontal sinus. The frontal bone has a space in it that can get filled up with mucus if you have allergies, or if you're having a cold. If you have something called a sinus infection, this is something that can get infected. And if you have had a sinus infection, sometimes you can feel the pressure right where these X's are, and that's because this area is getting inflamed. So kind of a cool thing to see how big this little space inside your frontal bone really is. Okay, I think let's move on from there. Here are other images. Here's X-ray. You can color enhance the X-ray, and there's something called a barium contrast X-ray. So I'll show you this picture. So when you're taking images of soft tissue like your organs, they don't show up very well in an X-ray. So what they can do is they give you a radio opaque substance. So they have you drink, or you can inject some kind of dye, right? This is barium sulfate dye. This poor person had it through the rectum. So they had put this dye into the rectum, and you can see that the entire large intestine has been colored white because this dye has traveled through the large intestine. But it's nice that you can see the passage of the large intestine. You can see if there's any abnormalities, or if there's a kink or an area that looks abnormal, right? So you can see the large intestine really well with this dye. All right, so our next one is cross-sectional anatomy. This is a subspecialty of gross anatomy, and it's used in CT scans and MRIs. So this is where you get a cross-section of the human, and this takes special training as well for you to be able to read these MRIs or these ultrasounds. So let's take a look at here. So we have a liver, right? We have the stomach, we have the spleen, we have the vertebra here. Here's your vertebra. Your spinal cord would be sitting right in there. So it takes special training, but you can only see a cross section. Here's another couple images. Here's another MRI, and here's an ultrasound. And it's the same image, but it's the same portion of the body, but drastically different images. So it takes a lot of training to get to know how to read these things. This is just an example of another CT scan that has been used to look at lungs. And you can see that in a healthy lung, in this example here, we have a lot of black space. So again, air or nothing is dark in this area. And then where you have an abnormality or a very dark, dense mass, as you see here, that would be an area where you have lung cancer. It's abnormal, it's unilateral, it's only on one side, and it's a very dense object that's in the lungs, which is very abnormal. This is another cool image of an ultrasound. I just wanted to show you, this is spina bifida. So this is a fetus here. So this is the fetus. And then you can kind of make out the vertebral column that runs along here. And then this is an abnormality. So this is a portion of the skin and the fluid from the back protruding out from the vertebral column. So that has to be taken care of. That's very bad for the developing child. All right, so that were the different kinds of anatomy. Letter B tells you physiology. Physiology is the study of function. So in the next class that you'll be taking the function of the different parts that we're learning today. And for those of you that are curious, yes, you need the language of anatomy to help you learn physiology, but physiology is a very, very, very different course. So it really is like apples and oranges. So if you like anatomy, you may or may not like physiology, and if you hate anatomy, you might like physiology. So they're very different. All right, let's look at the levels of organization. So this is Roman numeral 2. I don't have a lot in your outline because this is review from Bio 3. So we are beginning from an atom. So this is just the hierarchy of organizing all of life, right? So our most elemental units are going to be atoms. So usually I ask the class, like, what is an atom? And if you think about what's some atoms out there, there's carbon, there's hydrogen, there's oxygen, nitrogen, right? But then when you put those together, you create a molecule. So atoms bonded together make molecules. And if you think of like, do I know any molecule names? You probably know water, H2O, right? That's a molecule. CO2, carbon dioxide is a molecule. O2, oxygen is a molecule. Some of you might know glucose, C6H12O6. And when molecules come together or create a larger kind of molecule, those are called macromolecules. So this is again review from Bio 3. Remember, our macromolecules are proteins. I'm sorry, my pen is fat. It's writing pretty fat here. Lipids, carbohydrates, I'm just going to put carbs, and then nucleic acids, like DNA and RNA. So those are the 4 macromolecules. When you put the macromolecules together, so proteins and some lipids and some carbohydrates and some nucleic acids, or maybe not nucleic acids, but you put those together, you get an organelle. So you should remember from Bio 3 that organelles are specialized units that are found inside your cells. They are sort of like nanofactories, right? They're individual, discrete sort of factories that do a specific function for the cell. An example of an organelle could be the mitochondria, right? This is again review from Bio 3. The mitochondria, there's something called the Golgi, the nucleus is an organelle. All right, so those are your organelles. When you put all of your organelles together, or many organelles together, the next higher level is a cell. And there are 2 kinds of cells. There's 2 basic types of cells in the world. Hopefully you remember this from Bio 3, or if you don't remember right now, you will when I say these. There are prokaryotic cells. Those are bacteria and archaea. And then there are eukaryotic cells that are found in all the rest of the organisms, right? Plants, animals, fungi, protists have eukaryotic cells. Remember again, the cell is the basic unit of living things. The cell is the smallest unit that can do all of life's processes. So here we are. So the cell, right? You can study the cell anatomy called cytology. The next level up is tissues. So many types of cells will come together to form a tissue. And remember, there are 4 tissue types that we're going to talk about, and these are all in chapter 3. So we have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and nervous. We'll get to those in chapter 3. And then we have organs. So organs is tissues coming together. So let's take an organ that we all are familiar with, the heart. Okay, so what is the heart? The heart is mainly muscle, right? So we know we have muscle tissue in the heart. But we also know that it's bound together with some connective tissue. I know that the epithelial tissue, by the way, is a lining. So any sort of free space or just the end of the organ, there's going to be some epithelial tissue on top. So outside the heart, there's epithelial tissue. Inside the heart, there's epithelial tissue because it's a hollow organ. So, and then we also have some nerves going to the heart to speed it up and slow it down. So your heart is, even though it's mainly muscle, it's composed of all of the tissue types that we just talked about. So that's a higher level of organization. Each organ also has a particular function, but then it works together with other organs to form an organ system. And then the organ systems come together to create an organism. Okay, so that is the levels of organization. So the question here is a level of organization that consists of the smallest living units in the body is what level? And hopefully you had put cellular, because that's correct. All right, moving on to the composition of the body. So what are we made of? We are made of primarily organic molecules. Organic molecules are going to be primarily made of carbon and hydrogen. So you can see how carbon and hydrogen and oxygen make up most of our body. So if there's an alien that came down with an atomizer gun and just blew us up into atoms, right? This is what we'd mostly come out: hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen. But then also, obviously, we're going to have other things in our body. So there are calcium, phosphorus. You can see all this stuff, right? Sodium, sulfur, chlorine, magnesium, iron, iodine. And then there's something called trace elements. So trace elements are very, very important. However, the word trace means that we only need them in very, very, very small amounts. We need them. We can't live without them, but we need them in very small amounts. So the word trace, right? So if you hear like a CSI TV show says, oh, there was trace amounts of blood at the crime scene, trace is very small. So let's take a look at some of our trace elements. Fluorine, boron, tin, zinc, manganese, copper, right? Who knew aluminum is usually thought of as sort of a toxin, but we do need some of it in our body, has a role in our body. So very small amounts. And then if you move over here, right, so this is the chemical level, and this is the molecular level. What molecules are we made of mostly? So we can see that water, right? If you've heard that we are made of mostly water, that is correct. Proteins is next, lipids is next, and then carbohydrates. So mostly water and proteins, lipids, then carbs. Okay, let's talk about the next topic, and that's our organ systems. So you're going to be able to, on the first test, you're going to be asked to identify the function of all the different organ systems and also the major organs in those organ systems. So let's run through them really quickly. Integumentary system is skin. So that is only your skin, and that's chapter 4. We're going to go through that for your first test. The skeletal system is your bones and joints. The muscular system is your skeletal muscle. Now, there's other kinds of muscle in your body. There's muscle that's in your organs, like in your stomach. There's muscles that your heart is also a muscle, but they're not included in the muscular system. This is the muscle that can move your body around. So this is known as skeletal muscle. Okay, just to give you an FYI. The nervous system, obviously brain, spinal cord are nerves. The endocrine system, for those of you who aren't familiar, this is going to be the system that produces hormones. Okay, so there's all different kinds of glands in this system. Some of them will overlap with other systems, but if it secretes a hormone, it belongs also in the endocrine system. Cardiovascular system. So cardio refers to the heart, right? And then vascular refers to the blood vessels. So the cardiovascular system is heart and blood vessels. So don't forget those blood vessels. The lymphatic system is a system that is going to include your lymph nodes. It's a screening system. It's your immune system, but it also balances the fluid in your body. So I want you guys to read about these in your book. Okay, and know the major organs that are in the system. Oops, sorry. The respiratory system, obviously it's lungs, and the tubes that lead to your lungs to exchange gases. It's going to also include the upper respiratory system that's in your head, so the nose, and your throat, and your larynx, where your voice box is. The digestive system, I think you guys are familiar with that. The urinary system, and the reproductive system. So know the basic functions of each system and know the major organs in those systems. All right, so let's see if we can answer this question. The major function of what system is internal transport of nutrients, wastes, and gases? So I'll pause it, let you think about it. All right, so you can pause these anytime we come to a question. I encourage you to pause the lecture and come up with your own answer and see if it's correct, but I'll let you know what the answer is. It is going to be the cardiovascular system. Now, this might surprise you because we're transporting things around our body, and a lot of people look at gases and they automatically say respiratory system, but that's not correct because the respiratory system does not contend with nutrients or wastes. And this is also internal transport, so we're moving around inside of our body different substances, nutrients, wastes, and gases. So that's the cardiovascular system. So your heart pumps around your body, the nutrients you eat, the waste products your body makes, and also the gases that you inhale and also need to exhale. All right, so we'll pause it. That's the end of part 1.